Tonight, Nigel Farage launches Reform's manifesto, saying his real target is winning power in 2029. But if that's the case, why isn't he ruling out switching to the Conservatives after this year's election? We'll be going through Reform's spending plans to see if they add up, and I'll be joined by the party's deputy leader, David Bull, who tells me it's a travesty if parents don't spend enough time with their kids. Also tonight, we're with the SNP leader John Swinney as he tells us his party will have the most left-wing manifesto at the general election. So as both Reform and the SNP turn their attacks on Labour, I'll be speaking to their Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, that is Darren Jones. And we saw a new social media tradition for party leaders last night, at least those trying to win votes in England anyway. The now obligatory Come on England post. We'll have a look at how they went about it. Cheering me on from the sidelines tonight, Salma Shah and Baroness Bennett, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Monday, I'm Sophy Ridge live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Let's talk Reform UK. A poll tonight has them level pegging with the Conservative Party. They leapfrogged them in a survey last week. And I know that right now there'll be people shouting at their screens, saying things like, it's just one poll, and why is the media so obsessed with Nigel Farage? And of course there'll be others who will quietly put a cross in the box next to Reform at the election. For many reasons, but probably mostly because they just can't bring themselves to vote for the Conservative Party. So today we will be talking about Reform UK, particularly as it's their manifesto launch. Look, it's not really a serious manifesto from a party that thinks they'll be in government and will have to make the sums add up. Some of these policies, frankly, just don't pass a smell test. So they're promising to get NHS waiting lists down to 0 in 2 years. 0. I mean, this is not a blueprint for government. But I guess it doesn't have to be. Even Nigel Farage isn't calling it a manifesto. It's a contract that's a 5-year programme to challenge both the Labour Party and the Conservatives, in his words. And here's the thing. They're not aiming to run the country. They're aiming to steal as many votes as possible from the Conservative Party and, as a result, to change the political weather. Net migration of 0, NHS waiting lists at 0. I mean, who needs a serious programme for government if a deeply unserious one will do the job? Let's have a look, shall we, at what is in Reform's manifesto, because I should say there are some quite interesting policies in here as well. So the first thing to say is, unsurprisingly, there was a big emphasis on migration. So they've already talked up this one. They want to freeze all non-essential immigration. They also want to bar student dependence, and they want to introduce a new or raise the national insurance rate as well to 20% for foreign workers. This is all about trying to reduce net migration right down to 0. Taxes, this is another thing that they're being pretty ambitious on, to say the least. So they want to lift the income tax starting threshold to £20,000. They also want to reduce the main corporation tax rate to 20% as well, and they want to support marriage through the tax system. So they want to introduce a 25% transferable marriage tax allowance for either spouse. Another big pledge that we've heard a lot about is around energy and the environment. This is the big one here. This is a lot of what this is about. They want to scrap net zero completely. So the party would also want to start fast-tracking licences of North Sea gas and oil, so more digging in the North Sea. And they also want to legislate to ban the ULEZ, clean air zones and low-traffic neighbourhoods as well. That's an idea that they want to say they want to stop the war on drivers. Let's look at health next, shall we? Because the party are saying that they want a new 0 basic rate of tax for frontline NHS and social care staff. That's to try and end staff shortages. They also want tax relief of 20% on all private healthcare and insurance, so effectively trying to make it more desirable to go private. And they also want a new NHS voucher scheme as well, so help private treatment for NHS patients who aren't seen in good time. A couple of other bits that stand out in the manifesto as well. This is a big one. Some right-wing Conservatives would like to see this one in their manifesto as well. They want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights. They also want to replace the 2010 Equalities Act, and they want to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP within the year 3. So the party have costed some potential savings as well. So they want to try and make savings here. They want £50 billion, whopping £50 billion off government departmental spending. So, big squeeze there. They also reckon that they can raise £35 billion by stopping bank interest on QE or quantitative easing reserves in the Bank of England. Quite an interesting one there. Lots of debate about whether that figure is true. £30 billion they also think they can raise through scrapping net zero and tax subsidies as well. So, you know, a big blockbuster manifesto from Reform. Is it at all realistic? Is it a programme for government? You'll have your own view. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, was at the manifesto launch. He sent this report.
Merthyr Tydfil in Wales, the birthplace of the Labour movement and one of the most deprived parts of the country. This isn't what big party manifesto launches usually look like. But then this is no usual manifesto launch. Reform UK say it's their contract with the public. One man centre stage and relishing it.
Guess who's back? Back again!
Even Nigel Farage admits this is not a plan for government.
We are not pretending that we are going to win this general election. Our aim and our ambition is to become a real opposition to a Labour government.
The contract packed with policies beyond immigration and at enormous, eye-watering cost.
The scale of this, it's deeply unserious, isn't it?
That's right, it's radical, it's fresh thinking, it's outside the box. No apologies from me on this whatsoever. This would represent a fundamental transformational change within the British economy.
The party could win millions of votes, but is unlikely to end up with more than a handful of seats. So would Nigel Farage consider joining the Tories, as some in that party want?
Good Lord, no. They don't. I mean, the Tories don't agree with any of that.
Is that a categorical rejection
Oh,
of
look,
ever...
I can't tell you what I'm having lunch in 5 years' time, can
Can't
I?
you? You won't rule it out.
The ambition. I'm ruling it out. The ambition.
OK, you are ruling out joining the Conservative Party at any point after the selection.
The Conservative Party needs to be replaced.
But you are ruling out joining the Conservative Party, even if you're an MP in the next Parliament, at any point. I just want a categorical statement to that fact.
That is absolutely not on my agenda. And I can't rule out being dead within 5 years.
OK, I think we can hear that you're not ruling out membership of the Conservative Party.
I might be dead.
Nigel Farage brands himself a straight talker, but unusually evasive about his own future. Here, 170 miles away from Westminster, determined to show he will take on the other party leaders. Now, Reform may not win a single seat at the general election, but are any of the other leaders brave enough to take him on directly?
Well, you certainly get a lot of noise from Nigel Farage, but I'm focused on the real choice in this election. 14 years of failure under the Tories, or a fresh start with Labour, and all the noise is off. Don't change that central choice, which is what's going to be on the ballot when we go to it.
Nigel Farage's entrance into the campaign has been a nightmare for the Prime Minister. One of his top ministers admitted this morning that the Tories are now unlikely to win this election. He can't deny how difficult it is.
It's been a very difficult time for the country over the past few years, and of course I understand people's frustrations with that. I mean, that's undeniable, and I've been very clear that we have made progress, but there is more to go. But the point now is we are on the right track, and this election is about the future. The choice is clear. If you want your border secure and migration down, if you want your taxes cut, your pension protected, it's only the Conservatives that are going to deliver that for you.
Nigel Farage wants to sign a contract with the electorate, but he is a man who changes politics in often unpredictable ways. Does even he know what his future looks like after Election Day? Sam Coates, Sky News, Merthyr Tydfil in Wales.
Well, among the pledges in Reform's manifesto are £70 billion worth of personal tax cuts, but do the sums add up? Well, the person who's worked it all out is our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. And Ed, you've been crunching through all of the manifestos, looking at the numbers. What have you got for Reform?
Well, I'll give you the quick spiel first of all. And actually, so in terms of the question of whether the numbers add up, on the basis of the figures that they have given us in their contract,
contract.
It does. I mean, it does add up. Actually, it's better than adding up because they say they're going to bring in £150 billion worth through lots of spending cuts, a bit of tax rises, and then they're going to spend £141 billion. And actually, if you look at the difference between those two kind of bars, That's quite sensible, because there's a £9 billion buffer. This is supposedly not making the mistake that Liz Truss did of kind of unfunded tax cuts. You've got money coming in, but the problem is that when you delve into, actually both of these sides, but delve into this side, where is that money actually going to come in, then there are some other question marks. You can kind of poke some holes into it. And in particular, well, first of all, the money going out, the stuff that you know, there's been lots of talk about, primarily is this bar here. So I know there's lots going on here. This is because it's every single part of their manifesto in numerical terms. But this is the biggest giveaway. It's kind of about £70 billion. And when you look at that, that's where the income tax, raising the personal allowance to £20,000, this is a big giveaway. This is a big giveaway, cutting stamp duty to zero, basically abolishing stamp duty for anyone buying a house below £750,000. And then you've got raising inheritance tax threshold. So for a lot of people, they look at that and like, this is fantastic. You know, we'd all love to have a lot of that stuff potentially. However, in order for this to work, you've got to have this side of the equation working as well. And that means bringing in the actual money. And here, like I looked, so we can talk about the other things, but because time was of the essence, I looked at one of them and tried to kind of delve into it, which is the biggest thing. Like, are they, and this is basically, we think by slashing wasteful spending, we can raise £50 billion, okay?
Right. Sounds great. Let's get rid of it.
It sounds great, and absolutely. The problem is, okay, so if we take that, so that's the £50 billion, that's all of government spending, excluding stuff like investment and debt interest payments. And actually, that does work. Like if you take £5 in every 100, which is what they're talking about, that's about £1 trillion. That does work out as 50 billion. But the thing is that you can't really assume that you can kind of economise on all of that, because there's bits of that they definitely don't want to be cutting, like the state pension, £140 billion of it is state pension. There's bits they've kind of already committed the money from, so they definitely say they want to slash welfare. You can have a debate about how realistic that is, but they have already kind of got that money in another bit of the manifesto. So if you include it there, it's double counting. So you kind of got to get rid of that. That takes it down to 680. And then you've got other bits and pieces like defence and international aid. They do want to slash international aid. They want to kind of halve it. But again, they've already got that money in their pockets in another bit of the manifesto. So if we include that, that's kind of double counting. Defence, they want to increase. Health, they want to increase as well. But like giving the benefit of the doubt, you kind of really only have about £600 billion to play with. Still a lot of money, but if you're doing the same equation, and you could just say, oh, you need to have enormous austerity from this in order to make that, or you say, if you're going to kind of get £5 in every 100, then actually you're not making 50 billion, you're making 30 billion, okay? And that, again, doesn't seem like a big difference, but then when you kind of plug it back into the equation, take all of this together, then you're not looking at 150 billion here, you're not looking at a buffer, you're looking at the opposite. You're looking at that being 130, you're looking at it being smaller than the money going out, and suddenly you have a Liz Truss situation, which is you've committed all this money to go out and you don't have the money going in. And this is really kind of trying to give as much of the benefit of the doubt to these sums as possible. And this is only looking at one of quite a lot of different measures.
And there's no judgment on whether the cuts are right or wrong, or it's a right or wrong thing. It's literally just looking at the figures and working out if they're plausible in any sense.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, just literally just trying to work out whether you could actually do what they say that you could do. I mean, I suppose the only other thing to say is, like, the size of these is blooming enormous.
Yeah.
It's really big.
Yeah.
And actually, perhaps this is kind of one of the most telling charts. This is just showing you, and it's a representation of how much money Labour want to get out, how much the Conservatives want to get out, how much the Lib Dems want to get out. And from the height of these bars, you get a sense of just how ambitious or realistic the plans are. That's reform. OK, so it is more than 10 times what the Conservatives are talking about with their tax cuts. The only party that comes close, actually beats them on this, is the Green Party, which wants to raise taxes and spending by enormous amounts to kind of change the nature of the state. But that's, I mean, for me, that's a really striking chart, because it's like, here is the mainstream, and then here is those on the fringes.
I have to say, like, if for every one of these, it's like the least likely to form the next government, getting closer to you, and then the smaller the spending commitments. I feel like that kind of, it says quite a lot, perhaps, about how realistic they think their chances are.
It does, but you know what? I mean, like, I do think it's easy to pick holes in the reform. I mean, and to be honest with you, I've just picked one hole there and prodded a bit, and then there's this enormous gap. You can, and probably we can do the same, you know, with all of those policies. But they are at least, I mean, I think I can bring it up. They are at least raising some questions about interesting issues here, which I think a lot of people would like discussed. I mean, I talk about immigration. I think we were just talking before about whether their immigration plans are actually consistent with getting immigration down all that much. But they're talking about net zero. I mean, it doesn't seem... there's a debate I think people want to have about net zero, whether you're on one side or the other. And the one that I think is kind of interesting is they think they can make a lot of money by essentially forcing the Bank of England not to pay as much interest on the debt involved there. Richard Tice talked about it earlier, and so I don't want to go into details. It is quite complicated. But what I will say is, and I think there's a question mark over whether you could raise that much money, but frankly, they're the only party talking about that, and other parties probably should be, because it's a serious issue, and I wonder whether the Labour Party might end up actually doing something a bit like that when push comes to shove.
Yeah, and even if it doesn't have as much money, a couple of billion here or there,
yeah,
I'm
definitely.
not going to say no to that. Ed, thank you so much for all your work going through all the manifestos, crunching through those numbers as well. Thank you, Ed. Well, in a moment, we're going to be getting the thoughts of our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's in Merthyr for us tonight. First, though, I've been speaking to Reform's Deputy Leader, Dr. David Bull. Let's hear from him first. Thank you so much for being on the programme today. I can see you brought the manifesto with you. It's not a serious manifesto, though, isn't it, for a party that really thinks it's going to be in government. This is a manifesto that's designed to influence the political weather, to steal votes off the Conservatives. Sure. That's right, isn't it?
I mean, I think we've been really clear. This is a 6-year project, and Nigel has been clear about that. But also, we're doing things rather differently. We're an insurgent party. We're building this from the ground up. And actually, the sense of excitement around the country is palpable. And certainly, if you go to Clacton, when Nigel made that first speech, people were hanging off bridges, people were crowding around. When I go around the country, people are thrilled and say stuff like, well, it's, we're absolutely delighted you're here. That's really good for politics, actually, that people are engaged. And when we look at who actually is keen on our party, we're winning amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. We're also winning
Winning amongst... What does that mean?
So it means
Labour
well, it appears that we have a huge traction from 18 to 24-year-olds.
Not winning, though, are you?
Well, I'd like to say winning. Yeah. Over 55s and also women as well. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. But look, when we started this, 3 years ago, we were at 2%. We're now on 19. That is an extraordinary feat.
Clearly, it's a growing party. I take your point there. But my question is that this is not a serious manifesto for a party that might be in government. And I think this chart that Ed Conway, our data and economics editor, I guess illustrates a bit more what I was trying to say. So the manifesto spending pledges compared, you can see there, this is effectively the spending and the tax, so the giveaway that each party is giving. The Greens are right up there and Reform are right up there.
Indeed.
I mean, those are the two parties that aren't going to be in power, so you're not going to have to try and make these sums add up.
So it's been really interesting, actually, and when you look at the way we've costed this, and this is at the back of this, that we've had people like 2 former deputy governors of the Bank of England saying, we like what you're saying. The fact is, we say that, as you can see in that 35 billion coming from QE, changing the way that we pay that interest.
But people say it's not going to be 35 billion, don't they? That's the whole
They do,
point.
but there again, I defer. I'm not an economist. I defer to people who are far cleverer in that.
But you admit people are saying that it's not...
But there are economics editors who say that actually it is right. So again, this is a conversation to be had. When you look at net zero, that's a saving of 30 billion. We believe there are government efficiencies of 50 billion, halving foreign aid, which brings it down to 6 billion. So we have actually costed it. But for me, the most important thing here is that it's not the same old dogma. There is actually drive and passion and vision, and that is really what we're setting out.
I mean, I guess as well, it's not just about the numbers. It's about, you're promising some things that seem to me to be genuinely kind of impossible. I mean, like leaving the ECHR in the first 100 days. I mean, you need to give 6 months' notice for a start. NHS waiting lists at 0. Net migration at 0. I mean, these things just don't pass the smell test. What are you going to promise me? England winning the Euros and me having a date with George Clooney? I mean,
well, maybe.
It's not realistic.
No, well, I mean, there's a lot.
Maybe it's not.
There's a lot in that question. But so, for example, if you look at the health service, obviously I'm a doctor, I wrote that policy. The fact is that we're spending £176 billion a year, at 11.7% of GDP, on the NHS. And there's this mantra, a dogma, it's a world-leading service. It isn't. 380,000 people didn't even start their cancer treatment in the appropriate time. That's unacceptable. 20 million people on waiting lists. What we're saying is actually it is not OK to wait, and we believe that we can get to 0 waiting lists. It will take time, I admit that, but there are a number of ways we can do that by keeping staff in the service, actually incentivising them to stay in the service, making sure that we pay back student debt if you stay in the health service for 10 years, and also the enlargement of the private sector. At the end of the day, for me, as long as patients get treatment, it doesn't matter where it comes from, but the money follows the patient and it remains free at the point of need.
The other part of your manifesto that I was quite interested in was the family section, your manifesto commitments on the family. So you want to support marriage with the tax system, you want to make it easier for parents to stay at home to look after their children by front-loading child benefit to age 1 to 4. Just what's the reason behind that? What's the belief?
Well, we believe that children do better in stable relationships across the board, and actually we need to encourage that.
In marriage, you think?
In marriage, you know, and that marriage is an important bond, isn't it? Because I think what children desperately need is someone at home, and they need someone to be there and support them during their education. So we think that's a cornerstone, actually. And one of the things that I find really strange and very difficult to understand is the disconnect that children now have, because they have, when you come home at night, you want to be able to offload what's been going on at school, and you need someone at home to be able to do that. And if we can incentivise that through tax breaks or whatever it is, that has to be a good thing.
So you say that children do better with one parent at home. So you think basically if you're a child with 2 working parents, that's not a great upbringing for you?
No, I'm saying, of course it's incredibly difficult and parents have to work because of the cost of living. But actually the ideal would be to have a parent that is there available when children need them.
And do you think that children, I guess, a bit damaged if, you know, that doesn't happen?
Well, I think the biggest damage that's happened has been the lockdown due to COVID and the government's policy on that. There was no need to do anything more than one lockdown.
Because I think it's really, it's really interesting, this here. You know, so you say in the manifesto that the majority of mothers would choose to stay at home more if they could. What's the research on that?
So we polled extensively, actually, but I think if you talk to any mother, of course they want to spend time with their children. They want to see them grow and develop. And if you're spending all your time at work and you don't have enough time with your kids, I think that's a travesty.
You think it's a travesty? Yeah. And do you think it damages the children as well?
I think emotionally children need support as they grow and develop. There are lots of questions they have. You have to look at why children are now so obsessed with social media, and certainly from the point of view of having nephews and nieces, they're being told all sorts of stuff on social media that needs correcting immediately. One of the biggest things we've seen is the rise of anorexia and bulimia in young women and in young boys as well.
And what do you think that might be because you don't have parents at home?
Well, I think actually the parents are there and they need to counter some of the myths that are on social media. You know, these are not realistic images.
Do you think it matters if it's a mum or a dad or someone who's a gay parent? It doesn't matter at all. Just one parent should be at home with the kids.
Well, I think
in an ideal.
Well, in an ideal world, I think stability and support from whichever parent can do that, or indeed one parent one day, another parent the other day, is the ideal. And if we can encourage that, that's great.
Your manifesto also says Britain's got one of the highest family breakdown rates in the Western world, and you talk about children being born to unmarried couples. Half of all children grow up in separate households. We have the unhappiest teenagers in Europe. Do you think that divorce and sort of separation, I guess, has a devastating impact on children?
Well, I mean, look, if the marriage is that difficult, then obviously it is important that the parents split amicably. But for children, I just go back to the point that we know that children do better when they have a stable parenting, when they actually feel loved and supported. And that's about actually academic need, but also emotional need. And I think we're seeing a real breakdown in that, because I think children have been left to their own devices. Certainly, I was very fortunate. I had a great upbringing. My parents didn't have a great deal, but they gave us time, and that's really important.
Obviously, no one goes into a relationship wanting to split up, right? And you touch upon that in your answer as well, you know, that there are reasons, abusive relationships, for example, that people leave. I mean, I guess, you know, in the past, people did just stay together often and make themselves deeply unhappy, and that's not always a great place for children either. You know, is it just another way of making parents feel a bit bad about themselves? You know, you have to work, you've had a family breakdown. They might be listening to you right now thinking, oh, you know, that just feel pretty rubbish as a parent. No,
I'm not saying that at all, as you know. I mean, I'm saying that if obviously you can't live together, and if you want to get divorced, then that's obviously is something that you have to take upon yourself. But what I do think is actually that children, it's really complicated growing up, and you have a lot of pressures on you, whether it's through social media, it's the educational attainment. Also, we know that kids do better at home when there's a parent there and there's some form of stability at home, but also to be there to be able to help with homework, for example. And that's really important.
I want to talk a bit about the election now. Reform's chances at the election. You're standing, I think you said 620
We are,
seats,
yes.
so it's about 30 seats Reform aren't standing in. If you're in one of those seats, who should you vote for?
Well, obviously reform.
No, but if you haven't got.
Oh, I see. If you haven't, that's a very good question.
Who'd you go for?
The least worst option, I should think.
Yeah, who's that then? Who's the least worst
Or don't
option?
vote. If none of them actually appeal to you, don't vote.
So
but the really important thing is you have to vote. People died for the ability to vote, so I'm really keen that people do vote and they spoil their ballot paper. But look, the Conservatives are saying, oh, well, you can't vote for reform because it lets Labour in. Well, actually, the Conservatives will let Labour in, and I would argue that actually a vote for the Conservatives lets Labour in. So vote for us. And actually, we know Labour is going to win this election, so why don't you actually follow your convictions and vote for us?
I'm going to pin you down. How many seats is Reform going to win? Go on. What do you reckon?
So when we started this campaign, we thought 1 would be a great triumph. We're 3 years old, right? 2 we then thought would be really good. We're now being predicted in the MRP poll to have 7. Well, that would be extraordinary, wouldn't it, for a party that's
So what, you're going to go for 7 then?
Is
that what you're going to go for?
Look, I'm not a betting man, but our candidates are doing really brilliantly.
Come on.
Well,
you're the straight talkers. Come on.
No, I am. I'm saying anywhere between 3 and 7 would be marvellous.
All right. Thank you very much indeed. We're out of time. Good to have you on the programme today. So Reform UK and the Green Party, a little bit similar, both, promising the earth.
Well, I think the difference is, you said at the start that reform is not really serious, whereas you look at the reception that the Green Party manifesto got. We were described, if I'm allowed to mention the BBC Verify described us as economically credible. We're looking to invest in Britain's future. We're not saying we're going to slash away further at already broken public services. We're going to invest in our NHS, invest in our public services, and ensure that the people who have the broadest shoulders, who can afford to pay that, through a wealth tax, through changing the tax system to be fairer, that's what we're doing. But I think it's also important to, everyone's focusing on the fiscal side, where this also totally doesn't add up from reform is the abandonment of all the measures we need to tackle the climate emergency. I was on a call this morning with a farmer saying, my fields are flooded, we've got a food security issue coming down the line at us. The measures we need for the cost of living crisis are also the measures we need for the environment.
I'm interested in your thoughts on reform. Natalie saying that they're not serious, and certainly Ed Conway poking holes in some of their psalms. But they're becoming quite a force if you look at the polls.
I think the interesting thing about both the Green and the Reform position is, despite what they might say, they know that it's not theirs for the taking. It is not going to be their government that they form next. And therefore, it's about putting a position out there. And for the Green Party, just as Natalie highlighted and outlined, it was about having a new way of doing things, a new system, and presenting a new way of being. And with Reform, it is talking to people who would probably agree with a lot of what David Bull just said, but whilst it might be sort of a belief and it might be something that you think about, is it really credible when you work through how you're supposed to get governments to achieve this? And I think both parties have got a similar issue because they're going for the protest on either side of the electoral scale.
I'm keen to talk a bit about what Dr. Bull said in that interview, because I was quite struck by it, to be honest. There's been all sorts of analysis about whether the sums add up, whether they can get to net zero or migration or whatever it is. But the family stuff I thought was quite interesting, because they are, very clear in the manifesto, and he was very clear in the interview that, they do think that parents should be at home.
Well, my response to that would be, if you look at, we do indeed have a very high rate of marriage breakdown, relationship breakdown towards the rest of Europe. We also have the second longest working hours in Europe. We have huge problems with poverty. We have huge problems with poor housing, people having to commute enormous distances. Let's transform our society so people can have a balanced life. And of course, one of the things that's got a lot of attention in the Green Party manifesto, something that's been really growing as a social movement, is the idea of a 4-day working week as standard with no loss of pay. And people then have the time to actually spend with their family. They have the time to have a balanced life, which is just simply, we have a deeply unhealthy society at the moment, and that's showing in terms of relationships. And also just on children and social media. What we need is an education system that equips children with critical thinking skills, that equips them with media literacy, instead of focusing on exams, pushing children through like a sausage machine through the exam factory. We need a much broader education for life, not just exams.
Do you feel that Reform UK is talking about things that the Conservative Party, I guess, couldn't talk about, particularly on kind of social issues?
I think what's interesting is that, way back when with David Cameron, there were elements of the Reform social plan that were around with David. I mean, you know, marriage tax breaks, for example, that was a very David Cameron Conservative thing. So that social element of it hasn't disappeared. And you've even got sort of, you know, the likes of Miriam Cates, for example, really talking family policy. So that social Conservative piece has always existed. Does it form what Conservatives should be saying in a general election campaign? Is it the thing that is going to really touch the hearts of those people who are still available for the Conservatives in terms of voters? I'm not sure. And you can definitely see that the Conservatives aren't going to go down that social tack because it opens up a lot of different questions, particularly about people's personal lives. And, you know, if people do take public office and go through a divorce and all that kind of stuff, what does it actually mean? What does it mean for free votes on things? Reform can say it, mainstream parties can't.
Interesting stuff. Thank you both very much indeed. We'll be hearing more from you throughout the programme as well. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, the SNP offers some hints of what it might say in its manifesto, which has been launched on Wednesday. We've been hearing from the SNP leader, John Swinney. And we'll be discussing whether Rishi Sunak, Sir Keir Starmer and Sir Ed Davey are deliberately hiding their sporting allegiances as they cheered on England last night.
I'm Martin Brunt, and I'm Sky's crime correspondent. My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please, please do not hurt her. Please give our little girl back.
We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. For detectives, the first 48 hours after a murder are crucial in the search for clues. The public expects them to find Jill Dando's killer soon. The British detectives are planning to meet forensic experts, academics, and even witch doctors. I remember the grimmest case, the Soham murders of schoolgirls Holly and Jessica. I felt I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it. Ian Huntley was arrested and charged within a fortnight of the murders.
I've never murdered anyone, I've never raped anyone. What am I in jail for?
The parole board has to decide if Bronson needs to be kept locked up for the safety of the public. My biggest challenge was to persuade a jailed diamond thief to answer my letters. Martin Brunt, Sky News, at the Old Bailey.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, whether parties choose to go on the road tells a lot about their election strategy. So let's check on where they've been out and about today in our lovely interactive map. Right, first up, let's go to the Conservative Party. Rishi Sunak focusing on the energy policy. So he was campaigning in East Yorkshire, in Lincolnshire and also Cambridgeshire. So a nice little line of blue there. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer and the Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves, well, they were in Hampshire today talking about Labour's pledge for a national wealth fund. Starmer also went to Bristol and he visited the Rovers football ground. And that's the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar. He was in South Queensferry for the launch of their battle bus. Now, the Lib Dem leader, Ed Davey's been in Yeovil there, in Somerset. He also visited a beach in Devon. Was it some kind of holiday? They were campaigning on their idea to expand rural fuel duty relief as well. Reform UK, of course, as we've been discussing, they were in Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, launching their manifesto contract, whatever you just tried to call it. And the SNP's Swinney, there we go, right up at the top. He was in Stornoway for the Scottish National Party, traditionally nationalist area where the party have been feeling a bit of pressure. Our Scotland correspondent Conor Gillies has been speaking to the SNP leader in the Outer Hebrides.
It doesn't get more remote than here. The Isle of Lewis, a world away from Westminster. For mum of two, Donna.
We need them to speak up for the island communities. Feel like we've been left behind from all the politicians. Feel like none of them are truthful and are back in our corner.
The same story for 77-year-old Crofter Donald.
You feel left behind a bit?
In some things we are, but quite a lot of things, I think. I don't think they do enough for the island.
In many ways, these islands are a microcosm of a battle playing out across Scotland. For a long time, the SNP have held this seat, but the polls suggest they could be in trouble this time around, triggering a fierce contest in a community on the edge of society, on the edge of the UK. SNP leader John Swinney came here pledging what he calls the UK's most left-wing manifesto, attacking Labour, a pitch to half energy bills for vulnerable households.
Can you actually deliver this?
Well, it's something that the SNP wants to see happen, and we put it into this election debate to ensure that people understand these are the values of the Scottish National Party, and we want to put them into practical effect.
But how will you be able to put it into effect?
Well, this is a United Kingdom issue. This is what the reserved powers of Westminster should be addressing.
You also mentioned broadband and telephone social tariffs as well. Is that part of the policy?
Yes, it's about recognising.
But that already exists.
In our 21st century society, we've got to have in place the financial assistance for people who are facing financial hardship and difficulty.
But you're announcing something that already exists. There's already a social tariff for broadband and telephone via Ofcom.
Well, not in the comprehensive form that we need to have it.
The SNP has been the dominant political force in Scotland for a decade, but for the first time in many years, it seems the party has a fight in its hands, one where its opponents sense a serious opportunity. Conor Gillies, Sky News in Stornoway.
What a beautiful place that really looks. And if you look on your screen now, you can see the full list of candidates in that constituency, the full list of people standing to be the next Member of Parliament. Right, let's talk to Salma and Baroness Bennett, shall we? It's interesting, isn't it? It feels a little bit like all the parties are trying to focus their attack lines on Labour.
Well, I mean, the reality is where the polls are and the fact that they've been so stubborn means that everybody feels, well, in the firmament anyway, that the victory for Labour is a foregone conclusion.
Do you think it is a foregone conclusion?
I think that it's very hard to have polls that good and for it not to eventually lead to a majority. The size of the majority is the thing that's going to be in question and contention. And that's why you see all the smaller parties and indeed the Conservatives now switching their messaging. In 2019, Boris Johnson did something that was completely unfathomable, and he brought together this coalition across the right. He sort of reached a bit across the centre. He was very lucky in his enemies and his opponents. And so that is obviously fracturing away, and you can see it. What's interesting for me is that clearly, and you know, Sam's talked about it, Ed's talked about it this evening, it is that question of trust. It is that idea that nothing's going to change and things aren't going to get better. And so the election campaign you see is a consequence of those two things marrying together. The single issue of 2019 that brought everyone under this one banner of the Boris Johnson Conservative election, and now things getting so bad that it's just fracturing away.
It's interesting to hear you say that Boris Johnson was quite lucky with his enemies, because I guess you could say the same with Keir Starmer in many ways. You know, the drift away from the Conservative Party across much of England, and then, of course, in Scotland, where the SNP are having a tough time.
Well, they are, and it's really interesting that they are really making promises and not living up to them. One of the interesting things about the SNP is the fact that they've been fighting against taxes on the windfall profits of oil and gas companies. But I think it's worth picking up the point about why people are attacking Labour, and that is that, I mean, the graph that we saw from Ed Conway earlier, they are just being so timid and essentially promising we'll keep things much as they are now, we'll be a bit more competent and maybe a little bit nicer, And that's the offer that's coming from Labor, and that's something that deserves to be attacked. But I think the other thing too is, I mean, reform, some of the polls are showing reform above the Tory party, but that's a measure when I knock on doors in what have been Tory constituencies that have a very good chance of soon being Green constituencies. There are so many people who say variations of, I voted Tory all my life, but I just couldn't possibly do it now. And interestingly, I think Boris Johnson is one of the reasons for that, particularly women who are saying they're just not respectable anymore.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. Good to have you here. Coming up next on the Politics Hub, why Reform chose to launch its manifesto in the traditional Labour heartlands of South Wales. Well, at Reform's manifesto launch earlier, Nigel Farage says he chose to hold the event in Wales because it shows what happens to a country when Labour is in charge. Our political correspondent Gurpreet Narwan was there.
The Welsh Valleys, solid ground for the Labour Party. But now a new threat is emerging in these heartlands. Enter Reform UK. They chose to launch what they call their contract with the people in the Gurnos council estate in Merthyr Tydfil. With 56% of people here voting for Brexit, it could be fertile ground for reform.
The people can be better off.
But are people here buying what Nigel Farage is selling?
I think he's the only man that can take us out of the mess we're in. And I really hope, that he does what he says he's going to do. The other two parties are just, there's no shape in them, nothing.
I'll be voting for the first time. It'll be for Reform UK.
It's not really my type of thing, but I've had to put myself on the electoral roll and everything else to get it sorted.
Labour used to be. Labour, yes. I'm all for this man now. Reform all over.
Yeah.
About an hour away in Port Talbot, Reform UK hopes its ideas could resonate for another reason. It will scrap net zero. Thousands of workers here could lose their jobs when the blast furnaces close.
Net zero isn't our enemy here, you know what I mean? Like I said, we're not arguing that we don't want a green steel industry going forward. The opportunity for the future for the steel industry is a green steel economy.
And you're hoping Labour might be the ones to deliver it?
Well, they're the only ones with a sort of showing support so far then.
I think, our preference is Labour, but, if Nigel Farage or anybody else can help us to get a future that's a just transition and protects not only the 2,800 workers here, the contractors, the families and the communities, we'll work with anybody.
I got no time for them whatsoever. They're just taking advantage of a situation, and they are no better than the Tory party. They will desert Wales, they will desert Port Talbot if ever they get power. I've got no comment to mention on them, and I don't want to speak about them, to be honest.
People here are crying out for change, but they've heard the promises before, and Reform UK has still got some convincing to do. Gurpreet Narwan, Sky News, South Wales.
If you look at your screen now, you can see the full list of candidates who are standing in the two constituencies featured there in Gurpreet's report. The full list of candidates standing in those two constituencies on your screens right now. Well, earlier today, I spoke to Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones. I asked if he was worried about reform.
Every party is able to put forward candidates and their proposals at an election. What we're focused on in the Labour Party is working hard in every constituency across the country to sell our message of change. I would point out that I think we're probably the only party now that has a fully funded, fully costed manifesto. The Reform Party manifesto today has tens and tens of billions of pounds of commitment with no explanation as to how they're going to pay for it, which seems to be exactly the same as the Conservative Party manifesto, with the Chancellor himself, Jeremy Hunt, confirming today that the money's not there to fund their policies.
This is a really sort of genuine question. I'd be really interested to hear your honest take on it, if you kind of put the party lines to aside for just 1 minute. And I know that, left and right descriptions are sometimes a bit out of date, but Reform are a right-wing party. They're further to the right than the Conservatives. Nigel Farage has been at the helm of that charge in the UK in recent years. He may get elected this time round. Are you a bit worried about Reform taking votes off the Conservative Party? Or are you thinking, actually, you know what, I'm really relaxed, they're hurting our old enemy, the Tories, I don't care? Or are you a bit worried about what the rise of Reform might mean for politics here in the UK?
Well, look, this is about the battle of ideas in our democracy. It's not for me to worry about the Conservative Party. They should be worrying about themselves. My job is to make sure that the Labour Party is fit for government and putting forward...
Reform? Are you worried about the rise of Reform specifically?
Well, as I say, I mean, the arguments between Reform and the Conservative Party is a matter for them. It's not a matter for me.
But it's not. It's about our whole country, isn't it? It's about our whole country and the kind of politics that we have. And, I don't accept the line that Reform are the same as the Conservatives. Reform want zero net migration. They want to leave the ECHR. They want to abandon net zero. They are a different proposition to the Conservative Party.
Well, it depends which Conservative politicians you talk to. I mean, some of them will say in the Conservative Party that they're more aligned with
That's not in the manifesto, though, is it? It's not in the manifesto.
No, but I think some Tory MPs will be disappointed by that. Look, this is really a conversation you should be having with Conservative and Reform politicians. As I say, how the right have an argument amongst themselves is kind of a matter for the right in British politics. What we're focused on is putting forward a credible manifesto for change that we think the whole country can get behind and winning as many Labour seats as possible so that we can form a Labour government on July the 4th.
Still to come on the Politics Hub, party leaders pictured cheering on England as they beat Serbia in their opening match of the Euros. But how did they go about it? We're going to have a look next.
Elephants do rumble, and the rumbles have got different meanings at every moment. They will understand the meaning by themselves. For example, some of the rumbles are like complimenting or Some of them are like not happy, and some of the rumbles are warning. And so the elephants will understand amongst themselves what the communication is all about. We have experienced it here in the nursery by seeing one of our orphans rumbling at a certain center, and then the other one who is a little bit farther away responding to that rumble, not the one too close. So that tells us clearly that they do have names and they do communicate to one another through those rumbles. It would be the matriarch that will give the names because the matriarch is in charge of all the rest of the herd. And the matriarch controls and make commands to the rest of the herd. Elephants can communicate through the rumble, can communicate through the voices. They know the voice of one another. They know the voice of the people as well. They can identify different animals and different people by smell, natural scent, and not the perfumes. Regardless of the perfumes, they can really identify you by your natural scent, and they can communicate also through the same. They have bad days sometimes because when one is not in a good mood, you will realize that that elephant does not want to get close to the others, and that elephant is on his or her own. And you might realize some of those elephants, when they're in a bad mood, they want to bully everyone around. They do have different temperament, just like we human beings. Everything that is associated with people is associated with these elephants as well. Elephants stay in herds and families, and they protect one another in that family. And they'll always want to make sure that all the members of their herd are safe. And if a new stranger comes in the herd, they will not accept that new member right away. They will need to communicate to the new member and know why the new member wants to join them. And if they happen to find a young one, because they are very maternal, the females are very maternal, if they happen to find a young one, they'll always want to protect them within their families.
Hello, welcome back to the Politics Hub. Now, the general election is not the only long-running campaign happening at the minute. Just in case you've been living underneath a rock, the Euros have begun in Germany and England had their first match last night. They beat Serbia 1-0. Now, I've become a little bit obsessed with the pictures that politicians have been posting, showing them watching the big game. I just want to show you what I mean. Here's Rishi Sunak. The first one, the Prime Minister posted this one. You can see the strategically placed England flag there, but he didn't wear the shirt. Maybe a bit worried about alienating voters who aren't English, perhaps. So that was Rishi Sunak's celebratory photo. Come over here. This is Keir Starmer's. He was at the pub with his deputy, Angela Rayner. There she is. She put this picture on of the celebrations. Now, he's just wearing the white shirt, isn't he? Got to think of those Scottish voters. If you're wondering who the other two chaps are, Matt Ford and John Richardson, two comedians. So, trying to get a bit, perhaps, down with the kids there with some comedians. And here's the Lib Dems. This is Ed Davey, who celebrated on board the battle bus. You've got the England flags there. But look at this. Perhaps a not quite so subtle manifesto just happened to be on the table as they posted. So you can see the campaigning never stops, even when you're watching the football. Salma and Natalie are still with us. I love this stuff, I have to say. Come on, spill the beans. So much work goes into these photo ops, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, it definitely does. So they'll know the England match is coming up and everybody's got to produce this content. And we live in this world where everything's about producing content. But I have to tell you, and it might be because, I'm a Tory, I've always been conservative, it makes me a little bit old-fashioned. I hate all these kinds of things. Even though I've done things like this in my career, I just, I want my politicians to be serious. I want to see them in a suit and a tie, and I don't really care about what they're doing down the pub or who they're hanging out with when they're watching the England game.
What do you think?
Well, I think we've got a real problem with trust in politics, and these heavily staged, obviously very carefully worked through photos really don't deliver any sense that there's a real person, a real passion there. And the other thing is I'd love to see with the Euros, how about use these as a chance to talk about encouraging grassroots sports, encouraging children's sports. We've seen so much damage with the selling off of school playing fields, with so much loss of public space.
You're right too, getting the political thing into the Euros chat.
This is serious
Natalie, who are you supporting in the Euros?
This is not. No, this is a serious point. This is not about image. This is about focus on elite sport is all very well, but let's focus on the grassroots where we're talking about young people's health, public health.
It's all about the pyramid. pyramid. Thank you both very much indeed. Lovely to have you on the Politics Hub tonight. We'll be back tomorrow at 7. Up next, it's the UK Tonight with Matt Barbette.